right, y'all, a couple people were asking about clutches, and I'm gonna go ahead and explain how the clutch on the Ford works. This applies to a lot of cars in, engineering standpoint, but not in physical construction. So long story short, this is your pivot fork. This is where it pivots on the kind of like a fork pin. It's where that dome is. It fits on top of that. This is your throwout bearing. This actually rides against the clutch springs. And then your cable would hook down there. So when you pull the clutch cable, it's doing this motion, right? So all you're doing is just sliding that bearing forward. The center doesn't rotate, just the outside. So that's the bearing portion of it. That's why it's a throwout bearing. It's throwing out the clutch, right? This is your actual clutch plate. So the clutch plate hooks onto here, and this is a 10 spline, right? And the clutch doesn't really ever move so much. It kind of sits in the middle. And then you've got this on the back side of it, which this piece is kind of heavy, so this is gonna be hard. So this is on the back side of it, right? And it's fitted up there like this against the bearing, okay? And then this is bolted to the flywheel. That's why it doesn't have to be on part of this. And what's important is the flywheel is bolted to the crankshaft, so this is always rotating with the crankshaft. So your pressure plate and the crankshaft, or the flywheel, always rotating with the crankshaft. When you push in the clutch, you push these springs in, right? So it's a flat surface, presses those springs in, which releases this big steel piece here, and it pulls it backwards away from the clutch plate. And now what's happening is your, and this is on backwards, by the way. So to keep it straight for everybody, that says flywheel side. It is important, so I don't get yelled at. There we go. So this is now stopped rotating because your clutch is in, okay? The crankshaft is still spinning around it. This is spinning around it, so both sides of it are spinning. It's like a reverse brake caliper. Think about it like that. And it covers the entire surface of this clutch. So you put in the clutch, this stops rotating, sort of, and the, especially if you're in, at a stop, the flywheel's spinning, right? And then what's turning when that's happening is your actual pilot bearing. So this is where your pilot bearing goes. This portion of the crank goes into the, or this portion of the input shaft goes into the crankshaft. And that pilot bearing sits right here. So the pilot bearing is allowing this to stay still while the crankshaft is spinning on it, right? That's what the pilot bearing's for. That's why if you press in the clutch and all of a sudden you've got a noise or something, it might be your pilot bearing. Also, because the clutch and input shaft have to slow down to whatever speed the transmission gear is based on wheel speed, this pilot bearing has to allow that to rotate. If this pilot bearing is seized up and it keeps this rotating, you'll have the situation where you can't get the shifter into gear. It's like stuck. That's because this is still rotating with the crankshaft. From a dead stop, don't complain about it too much. It's more of like when you try and shift and it takes forever to get to the next gear, it won't let you in. That's this kind of issue. So anyway, this is staying still while the crankshaft is rotating. When you let the clutch out, you're slowly releasing these springs, which allow the flywheel and the pressure plate to squeeze, and it starts to grip this clutch, and it slowly starts to rotate it, right? These springs are designed so if you dump the clutch or something, it allows a little bit of play between the shaft and the actual clutch plate. Unsprung clutches, that's why they drive harsher, is because these springs aren't here, and there's a direct connection between the flywheel and this surface and your input shaft, which is directly connected to your wheels, so you will feel it. So anyway, now you're driving, it's rotating, you're in, first, second, third gear, and you are, well, let's do this. If you are in neutral and you release the clutch, this starts spinning with this because it's clamped, like there's no way to stop that. So with it in neutral, your transmission input shaft is spinning in here, but it's not really connected to any gears, so it doesn't spin out the back. So when you release the clutch and you have a noise, right, that's because there's a couple things moving now. You have the input shaft spinning, you have bearings in here rotating, and this is also rotating, and then most importantly, which is usually the noise, is this is actually having to rotate at that point because, well, honestly, this rotates all the time. but when you release the clutch completely, if it's too loose, sometimes this skips on those teeth, and that's what your clutch adjustment is you're setting this bearing up against these springs. Not too tight because you're pressing the springs in, and not too loose because it'll make noise there. That's a possibility that it makes noise just from not necessarily a bad bearing, but it's skipping the outside edge of this. There is a specific way to adjust the clutch, which is not really considered factory setup, but I like my clutch a little tighter, and I can show you how to do that on the stock setup versus having to get a quadrant. Different video. Anyway, and then when your clutch is released, even in neutral, right, your this pilot bearing does not rotate with the crankshaft. The whole input shaft rotates with the crankshaft, so the pilot bearing's sitting still. So it can't be making noise at that point. If you release the clutch and it makes noise, chances are it's this one. If you push the clutch in and you're having trouble getting into gear and that makes noise, chances are it's this one. This one's worse in my opinion because it can actually damage the input snout. So that's pretty much what's happening in your transmission. And now you're driving like, let's say, first or second gear and you're about to shift to third. When you push the clutch in, this flywheel and input shaft is rotating at the speed of the crankshaft for the ratio of second gear, right? Well, when you go into third gear, this actually has to slow down a little bit because this has to match the speed of the output shaft, which is in third gear now instead of second. And this will actually rotate at a slower speed, hence why when you release the clutch, it pulls the RPMs down. So when you shift gears, this is spinning at full speed in second gear, 6,000 RPMs. Now it has to slow down to whatever RPM it's supposed to be in third gear at this wheel speed, and then you release the clutch and the RPMs on the engine get pulled down to whatever speed that is, and then it starts to accelerate again into third gear, and then shift fourth gear, starts to pull fourth gear, right? So that's what's happening when you're shifting your clutch in a 5-speed transmission. I hope you enjoyed it. We'll grab the next one later.